Hello, good evening.
Hi,
How's your head?
great. My name is Vitali from the Kiev region. I'm here to talk about history. How should I address you? Where are you from?
Mikhailu and Bodon.
What are you talking about, Mikhailu and Bodon?
Absolutely, any topics.
You can't talk about absolutely any topics, Mikhailu and Bodon. Trust me.
I'm educated enough to talk about any topic.
Then please explain to me the topic of quantum mechanics. What is the spin of a muon, and what is the value of a muon spin?
Spin. Quantum mechanics is a branch of physics that, studies very small.
What is the spin of a muon? What is quantum mechanics? That's the topic. I didn't ask you what quantum mechanics is. I said the topic is quantum mechanics. Question: what is the spin of a muon, and what is the value of a muon spin?
I can't give you the exact value of the spin.
So, you can't actually discuss topics in quantum mechanics. Well, that's what I think. Let's switch to the topic of history. Name the dates of the Crimean War in the mid-19th century.
You guys have a pretty funny show here, honestly.
When people tell me they can talk about any topic, I have some prepared questions.
All right, fine.
So, narrow down your topics to 2 or 3. Maybe they'll match up with mine.
Math?
Then we'll have a conversation. What?
Can you talk about mathematics?
At a 6th grade level. 13% of 100. How much is that?
13.
There you go. You've passed 6th grade.
No, but higher mathematics.
It's mathematics. No, I studied higher mathematics, but that was a long time ago.
And what about the local Laplace theorem?
I'll say it again. I studied higher mathematics, but that was a very long time ago. Besides mathematics, is there any other?
Do you have any understanding of history?
Wonderful. Let's talk about history then. What was the last history book you read besides textbooks and fiction?
First of all, history. History is not a science. Let's start with that, yes, to get on to more solid ground. I don't understand why we need to study history.
That's not what I'm talking about right now. If you don't want to talk about history, immediately dismissing it as not a science.
I'm just not discussing history right now. I just want to say that talking about history is as pointless as discussing, say, Morgenstern songs or any other random topic.
From your point of view, since you haven't read anything, as I suppose, except textbooks and fiction.
Depends on what kind of history you mean.
History as a science break time equals 0.5 s / really. What have you read besides textbooks and any other fiction at all?
There's the history of religion.
Let's start with the simplest, the very simplest thing. What book have you read on the history of religion, science, technology, or humanity? It doesn't matter, as long as it's not a work of fiction or a school or university textbook. Then we can move on.
Stephen Hawking on the Shoulders of Giants, or something like that, I think.
That's the history of science, the history of physics.
Yes,
But that's closer to physics than the history as such.
absolutely.
And have you read anything on the history of humanity, of people?
On the history of humanity and people, I've read biological literature.
That's closer to biology.
Absolutely.
Let's set that aside. Let's move on to history as the science of people and humanity. I mean exactly what I'm saying.
Well, I get it. You mean the conquest of territories?
The history of people and the history of societies.
No, I had enough of the school and university literature on that topic.
So you haven't read anything extra?
No, nothing additional.
All right, got it. That's why you have that view of history. I see.
No, I can argue why history isn't a science, and
How can you argue if you haven't read a single book about history as a science, about people and humanity?
what is science?
There are different understandings of science. There are exact sciences, natural sciences, and the humanities.
There's only one exact science, and that's mathematics.
The most exact science is physics. It is based on mathematics.
Without mathematics.
Mathematics is just as inexact as science. There are tons of problems in it that remain unsolved to this day.
Nevertheless, it is. Why isn't history a science? Because science is.
Look, I'm not discussing whether history is a science or not. I'm talking here about history. If you're interested in history, if you've read something, then we can have a conversation. If you're not interested in history, as you said, and are just trying to prove something to me, I'm not really against. Look, let me finish my sentence.
Yes.
I'm not really against your idea that history isn't a science, but then there's really no topic left for dialogue at all.
History is just a collection of individuals.
That's your personal point of view, but it has a right to exist. Please, there's no need to prove anything to me. That's not my topic. If you are interested in history, we can have a conversation. Did you have a question?
Yes, I do. What is your opinion on the Tatar yoke?
My personal opinion has absolutely nothing to do with historical events.
Do you believe it existed? That it was real?
The Tatar-Mongol yoke is a term coined in the 19th century. This term has long since become obsolete. So, if we asked your question correctly, Mikhail, was this an invasion of the Mongols into the territory of Rus? Was. No one can deny this. And to call it a yoke, as it is written in your school textbooks, is meaningless. The term is obsolete.
Yes. And when was the first clash with the Tatar-Mongol yoke?
1223, that is at the territory of Ukraine, that is the battle on the Kalka River. And a little earlier they entered the Caucasus, which is now Russian territory. But then it was not Russian territory.
You have some kind of academic degree in history, I understand.
I am a history teacher. So if you want to talk to me about history, I'm happy to do that. But trying to convince me that history doesn't exist, well,
No, history exists. It's just not a science.
that's your point of view.
It's my opinion.
Sorry, but opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one. They're not always right, though. And I'm not interested in your arguments at all.
Well, that's why I didn't argue. Do you teach at a university or at a school?
At a college,
At a college. Got it. What kind of college is it?
a humanities and pedagogical college. Are we going to talk about history or about my workplace, Mikhail?
What do you want to discuss about history?
Nothing with you, since you're not interested. Maybe your partner is, or does he have the same point of view?
I haven't read anything about history. I haven't even finished reading the textbook.
Even the poor textbooks. What do you think of Panasenka? What do you think of Panasenka?
What?
What do you think of Panasenka?
I haven't read Panasenko's book. I've watched all sorts of videos, though. Oh, by the way, I think I did read, or at least started reading, Karenzin's History of the Russian State. Does that count? It's pointless to read, in the early 21st century, a book written at the beginning of the 19th century, before history was even considered a science. That's what's called the pre-scientific period of historical study.
In any case, most of the information and relevant history is drawn from sources like these.
In any case, would you go get treated by a doctor who uses prescriptions from the early 19th century, or would you go to a doctor who practices medicine from the early 21st century? What do you think?
But history can't be modernized, right?
Once again, look, would you go to a doctor who prescribes medicine based on 19th century recipes?
Now,
Wait a second. Look, Mikhail, you're not answering my questions. You wouldn't go. Why do you think that history written in the 19th century is suitable for the 21st century? What do you think?
because history isn't a science and
But that's just your opinion. You have to understand, if you had read at least something about history, you would have a different opinion.
history hasn't changed since the 9th century.
It does change. It does.
Where does new information about history come from?
Let me tell you where new information comes from. First of all, new archaeological sources are discovered. In Karamzin's time, they basically didn't exist.
That's a minimal contribution.
For the history of Rus, that's not a minimal contribution, believe me. Then, parallel sources are discovered, which Karamzin didn't know about. Parallel sources are German, Scandinavian, Byzantine, and Arab sources that Karamzin wasn't aware of. Karamzin mainly relied on chronicles, but he treated them uncritically because history as a science didn't yet have its own methodology when Karamzin was reading these sources. Because a layman like Karamzin trusted the sources. But a historian approaches a source critically and doesn't trust it, but cross-checks it. So yes, it gets cross-checked. I've already told you, with archaeological data in parallel and with parallel sources, Byzantine, Scandinavian, Arab, Byzantine, and so on.
And how do you cross-check them?
Those, in turn, are cross-checked with other relevant neighboring sources.
So they cross-check each other?
In other words, there's such a thing as the methodology of history as a science, but unfortunately, you're not familiar with it.
Do you admit that history is distorted? Do you admit that history is distorted?
History is distorted because, first, there aren't enough sources,
Yeah.
and second, we don't always fully understand what's written in the sources.
And can the source itself distort information?
The source itself definitely distorts information because it was written by a person. We're not dealing with a fact. Like in physics, we're dealing with an interpretation of that fact. That's exactly why the methodology of history exists. You need to study history in order to understand how to critically verify a source, to extract and separate the author's own opinion, as you said, from the source, and get to the real fact that's hidden behind it. That's why, in some respects, history is a much more complicated science than physics.
Do you agree with the opinion that any historical fact that isn't supported by some kind of excavations or, well, real evidence confirming the fact is subjective? So it's impossible to.
Let me say it again. We, as historians, deal with documentary sources. An archaeologist deals with material sources, but material sources are silent. They only describe material culture, while written sources are created by people. And within the source itself, there is already a point of view, or, as you say, the opinion of the author of the source. That's why I repeat the same phrase again. You probably didn't understand it. That's why a professional historian must remove the author's personal opinion and views from the source and understand what fact the source actually confirms. And if this fact is further cross-checked through other sources, then the fact really did occur. But the interpretation or explanation of this fact by the author of the source needs to be removed, leaving only the actual fact. And if it is also archaeologically confirmed for the Middle Ages, for ancient times, then that's just wonderful.
You can't call it a fact. It's just a coincidence.
If you had read at least some historians who specialize in methodology who explain what a historical fact is. Right now, you're talking about facts, and you're doing it very logically and correctly, but at a very basic level.
Okay, so who was the first ruler of Rus?
There was no such thing as the first ruler of Rus. The formation of a state takes several years, if not decades, or even centuries. So your question is at the level of a school textbook.
That's exactly why I'm asking. School textbooks say that some Rurik ruled Rus.
There is no trace of any Rurik in any sources. We can't prove whether Rurik existed, and we can't disprove that he didn't. So the specific person doesn't really matter. A state comes into being due to economic, political, and social necessities, certain reasons. And who is the first ruler there isn't all that important. Rurik is a legendary figure. There's some Rurik of Friesland mentioned in Danish sources. But it's not possible to equate him with the Rurik that Nestor the chronicler spoke about. There is no Rurik in parallel sources.
As a historian, can you recommend any decent books on history?
Which one? If you name the topic, I might be able to recommend something.
Russian history. I think you know.
Well, which history? Which period?
A general history, one that, in principle, describes everything in detail. Well,
There can't be a universal. Since 2006, a 6-volume world history has been published under the editorship of academician Cheberian. There are 6 volumes. It's a great book, but since each volume is 600 or 800 pages, it's available in open access. And it covers the entire history of humanity, starting from, well, the Stone Age.
it's actually divided by, well,
So, the first volume is ancient history, the second one, I think, is the Middle Ages, the third and fourth are modern history, and, I believe, the fifth and sixth are contemporary history. This is the most fundamental work that's come out in Russia recently.
it's just that you're asking, like, what books have you read? One day you'll answer, like we read, every event from the 4th and 5th centuries.
No, but if someone hasn't read anything and still has their own opinion, you know what I mean? Back in Soviet times, if you remember Pasternak, the poet and writer, he's in our curriculum, Boris Pasternak.
Terrible.
Did you know he won the Nobel Prize in Literature for the novel Dr. Zhivago?
Yes,
And when this event was discussed in the Soviet Union, there was a classic phrase from that time. Everyone still remembers it. When one of the people discussing it said, "I haven't read Pasternak, but I condemn the novel." That's exactly what you're doing. Maxim, you haven't read the history of humanity, but you think it's not a science. It's the same thing. That's just a lack of education. It's not a big deal. It can be fixed with learning.
No, it's just that what's taught in school.
Maxim, that can be fixed with education. Forget about the school curriculum and start reading something serious.
All right, history in school is not a science.
No, it's not.
Let's put it this way.
History in school is a didactic subject, not a scientific one. I completely agree with you on that. As an author of history textbooks, I completely agree with you here. The history that's taught in school is not a science, so take an interest, read history as a science, and maybe your opinion will change.
And what's the practical use of that?
The practical use is that we understand the present, what's happening now. If we don't understand the past, we don't understand what's happening now. I can explain with a simple example, if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Both here and in your schools, there are 2 history subjects. You have one subject called national history and another called world history, right?
Yes.
We also have 2 subjects. One is called history of Ukraine and the other is world history. So, in our school subject, world history, from 7th to 11th grade, from the Middle Ages to the present, we always have 1 or 2 paragraphs each year that specifically cover the history of Russia as a separate section. There's a separate section on the Principality of Moscow, a separate section on the Tsardom of Moscow, several sections on the Russian Empire, several sections on the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Civil War. There are several sections on the Soviet Union and 1 section on modern Russia. All our textbooks include your history. And our students, even if they don't know Russian history, at the very least, they can look it up in the textbook just for general knowledge. In your textbooks, there's practically no history of Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries, or the Central Asian countries in world history. You cover these topics only in your national history course. Neither you nor I, and even you personally right now, have the slightest idea about the history of the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Your understanding of Ukraine and Belarus is also very limited. Maybe, just maybe, you have a slightly better idea about Central Asia because it comes up here and there.
No.
You have no idea about the countries that border you to the west and south. And this leads to, but on the other hand, you have a very good understanding from your history textbooks about Rus. And you asked me, who was the first ruler? And your school education system, which absolutely everyone goes through, except for clinical idiots who study in special schools. Everyone goes through the education system, and yet you have not the slightest idea about neighboring countries and peoples. But since your history includes the history of Ukraine, because Rus and Kiev is a huge part of Ukrainian history, which you, starting with Karamzin, incorporated into your own history. As a result, most people in Russia, at least those I talk to on Chatter, rarely think of Ukraine as anything other than Russia. And in practice, this leads to the fact that you have started an aggressive war against Ukraine and consider it just, supposedly reclaiming your own territories. There you have it, the practical consequence of your society's ignorance of its own history and the history of neighboring states.
Well, can I ask a question? Well, I don't think anyone in our textbooks actually writes that Kiev, like all the villages, is just a part of Russia and all that. It's just like 3 countries, 3 peoples, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. They all start as Slavs, like the ancient Slavs from Kievan Rus, and then...
I'll tell you how it's described in Belarusian textbooks. Want to hear?
Go ahead.
In Belarusian school textbooks, they say that on the territory of Belarus during the times of Kievan Rus, there was the Principality of Polotsk. There was supposedly a dynasty of the Rurikids there, but they were only loosely controlled by Kiev. And so, in the school of history textbooks of Belarus, they don't talk about Rurik, or Igor, Oleg, Vladimir, Olga, Sviatoslav, or Yaroslav the Wise, like it's described in your textbooks. They literally mention in just a few sentences that there was such a state as Rus, and that the Principality of Polotsk, which for a short time was subordinate to Kiev, very quickly, in fact, became independent from Kiev. And in their textbooks, they go on to describe the history of the Principality of Polotsk, and then its later incorporation into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They don't have an entire section about Kievan Rus. If you open any of your textbooks, you have 2 or 3 sections on Kievan Rus. You study the history of Ukraine in great detail. You write that this is Rus, that it's Russian territory and Russian princes, even though this territory is modern-day Ukraine.
Well, modern day.
Modern-day Ukraine and your territories.
It was simply the Principality of Kiev.
In your territories, that's the land between the Oka and Volga rivers, the inner flow of the Oka and Volga. In your territories, Slavs appeared in the 11th or 12th century, when the Russian state had basically broken up into separate principalities. That's when the Slavs appeared in your territories. And at that time, Baltic tribes and Finno-Ugric tribes lived in your territories. I'll finish, but you don't know a thing about this, because it's not written about in your textbooks. You describe the history of Rus in several sections, including the history of Ukraine as part of your own history. The result
The problem is...
is the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, but that's not the result.
It is the result of this.
No one is going to rewrite all of history just for the sake of a piece of land, just for Ukraine. It's just like the fact is that the people who later founded Moscow, Novgorod, and all those other cities that are now Russian cities, well, they were founded by people who lived in Kiev. So,
Look, Novgorod wasn't founded. Okay, I get what you're saying.
but the fact remains, people like this needs to be included in history, because they were there,
Novgorod was not founded by people from Kiev. Novgorod was founded by local tribes, by locals.
You didn't understand what I meant.
Novgorod was, young man, Novgorod was an independent state, sir, the Great Novgorod Republic, until 1471. It became part of the Moscow Principality only after the Battle of Shilon in 1471. Before that, it had nothing to do with your territory. It did not. You conquered this territory, and now it is yours. But you don't write about that. You describe Novgorod as originally Russian lands, even though there weren't even any Russians there.
Are you saying this based on your own words right now, or can you actually cite some real textbook?
Open any reference book. Look up the Battle of the Shilon River, 1471. Check what the relationship was between the Moscow Principality and, the Novgorod Republic. And you'll understand how and when Novgorod became part of what is now Russia, what you call Russia.
Can I ask a more relevant question, one that Russian patriots really like, so to speak? So how do people in Ukraine feel about the Banderites? And what exactly was the UPA? What's your opinion, for example?
The Ukrainian Insurgent Army was a national liberation movement whose goal was to achieve Ukraine's independence.
I know that. But they did have war crimes documented against them
By whom?
by suspicions.
Well, no, Volhynia. By those they were fighting against.
Was there the Volhynia massacre?
There was, but this Volhynia massacre is a Polish concept, meaning the Poles portray the tragedy in Volhynia as if the Poles were only victims and the Ukrainians were the criminals and butchers.
It's clear that it was occupied by the Poles.
Actually, it wasn't occupied by the Poles, it was occupied by the Germans.
Yeah,
In fact, in Ukraine, they prefer to call it ethnic cleansing. Poles killed Ukrainians, Ukrainians killed Poles. Both the German side was interested in this, because in this way, the Polish-German conflict that could have happened turned into a Polish-Ukrainian conflict. And the Germans kind of kept the situation under control. And this same conflict was also in the interests of the Soviet Union. Because the Ukrainian-Soviet or Polish-Soviet conflict was turning into a Polish-Ukrainian conflict.
what about the other?
Both sides are to blame for these problems. The Home Army, which massacred peaceful Ukrainian villages, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which massacred Polish villages.
All right. And what about cooperation with Hitler, for example?
Who?
The UPA and Bandera.
Bandera did not cooperate with Hitler. There is not a single piece of evidence. Your so-called patriots are always talking about the act of proclamation of Ukrainian independence. Supposedly, let me explain to you.
And Bandera as the leader, all of that. Where did it come from? The connection, the fact that Bandera was the leader there, the fact that Ukraine considers. Well, there are actual documents. I've read them myself.
Relax. Why are you so tense?
You don't think this is funny? The way they write, saying that we admire the German people who are helping us free ourselves from Soviet occupiers. Well, to help our people fight. And we express our utmost respect for your leader, Adolf Hitler. And you can just keep finding these letters, official statements, over and over.
If your ultimate goal, as in the primary objective of Ukrainian nationalists, is to meticulously create a sovereign Ukrainian state at a critical time when there's a brutal war raging between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and you fully understand that you desperately need powerful allies. The Banderites wanted to become allies of Nazi Germany. They wanted to, but they didn't. And no matter how beautifully they try to write about the Nazis, let me remind you that there is the verdict of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
8 volumes have been translated into Russian, although there are 42 volumes in total. 42 volumes are available in English and German, open access. You can look them up and read them. There are 8 volumes in Russian. Bandera was mentioned in these 8 volumes, which were translated into Russian, in 4 documents. All 4 documents were provided by the Soviet side, not the German side. All 4 documents were provided by the Soviet side. What is the essence of these documents? They say these are German documents submitted by the Soviet side, where it was stated by the Germans that the Banderites were preparing an anti-German uprising, that the Banderites should be quietly executed, and that no one should be told anything about it. These documents were submitted at the Nuremberg Tribunal by the Soviet side in order to strengthen the punishment for the Germans, for the Nazis, showing that they not only fought against the civilian population and the Red Army, but also fought against the Ukrainian National Liberation Movement. These documents were submitted by the Soviet side. They were not about Bandera collaborating with the Germans. If such documents had existed, then the Soviet side would have submitted exactly those documents. But they submitted documents stating that the Germans were quietly executing Bandera's supporters. And the Banderites wanted to cooperate with the Germans, but the Germans refused. Bandera hoped that the Germans would grant statehood to Ukraine, just as they did to Slovakia. Did they teach you that the Germans gave statehood to Slovakia, a fascist one?
We weren't taught that.
Did they teach you that the Germans gave statehood to the Croats on Yugoslav territory?
No, we weren't taught that.
But the Banderites were taught that. And so they hoped that the Germans would give statehood to the Ukrainians. But the Germans didn't give it. They forced Bandera to revoke the act of proclaiming Ukraine's independence, which stated that Ukrainians were hoping for Greater Germany and Adolf Hitler. But Bandera did not withdraw this document. He was put in a concentration camp where he spent time from December 1941 to 1944.
Yeah. So in the end, there wasn't any cooperation with, but there were joint parades, as far as I remember.
There were concentration camps that were set up
by Banderites. There were Ukrainian concentration camps. Did you know that the modern Polish state insists that the camps which were Nazi, located on Polish territory, should not be called Polish camps or by their Polish names, but rather German concentration camps and by their German names? There is the Polish name Oswiecim, which in German is pronounced Auschwitz. And the Poles demand from the whole world that these camps not be called Polish or Oswiecim, but German Nazi camps and Auschwitz. These camps were not created by the Poles, but by the Nazis. And the fact is, in these camps, part of the local guards, some of the unarmed local guards, were Poles, and in some places, some of the local guards were Ukrainians as well. But these are German concentration camps, created with the goal of exterminating the Slavic population, Ukrainians, Poles, Roma, Jews, and so on.
We actually have an interesting little book here, written by some German woman historian. Yeah. And, well, she basically describes the events involving the UPA and portrays them as not the most pleasant people, to put it mildly. Were there, in the end, persecutions of Jews by the UPA, for example?
There were no persecutions by the UPA. The UPA had quite a negative attitude towards Jews, but specifically towards Jews who supported the communist regime. And they were generally quite anti-Semitic towards Jews. And even some members of the UPA participated in the Holocaust. No one denies this, the extermination of Jews. But everyone was guilty of unsavory actions.
But isn't that a war crime? Participation in the Holocaust.
All sides committed egregious war crimes during the protracted conflict. Everyone, including the formidable Soviet Union, the resilient England, and the powerful United States of America. All warring countries fought valiantly while also committing widespread violence against innocent civilians and perpetrating heinous war crimes. But since the devastating war was initially started by Nazi Germany and its powerful allies, it was primarily the Nazi and Japanese war criminals who were subsequently tried at the historic Nuremberg trials and later at the equally significant Tokyo trials. And the countries that judged them had agreed among themselves before the trial that the war crimes of the other side, the anti-Hitler coalition, would not be brought up.
But that's obvious. History is written by the victors. That's clear.
No, it's not that history is written by the victors. It's that these trials were conducted in exactly that way. But now we can talk about war crimes committed by all sides. But at the same time, the initiators were, of course, Nazi Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, and Japan. The Stalinist Soviet Union should have been put on trial as well, but it simply fell apart. And the Soviet Union had no intention of judging itself.
I'm not arguing with that. Okay, fair enough. but there are photos where the OUN, those UPA people, are walking around with swastikas. So basically, together with the Nazis with swastikas.
Are you referring to the SS Galicia division because of the flag colors?
Maybe.
There are no photos of the UPA walking around with Nazi symbols. There simply aren't any. There are photos of the division. That's a German division, the Waffen-SS division. The Germans created more than 30 such divisions. Only one was Ukrainian. What?
Were Ukrainians involved in it?
Of course, Ukrainians served in the SS Galicia division. But these were Ukrainians who lived in the territory of the former Austro-Hungary and Poland. That's why it's not Ukrainian, but Galician. And there are two divisions, the 29th and 30th divisions. These are Russian divisions, which you don't know about. Although in any Wikipedia, if you look up the list of Waffen-SS divisions, you'll see the 29th and 30th Kaminsky brigades. Kaminsky was hanged by the Germans themselves, even though he worked for them, because of his particular cruelty towards the civilian population. The Nazis hanged a Russian for exceptional cruelty to civilians.
And what's your personal opinion of Bandera?
He was a figure of the National Liberation Movement. As I told you from the very beginning, his goal was to free Ukraine from Polish rule and from the Soviets, using the Germans as allies. But the Germans did not agree to this alliance. You know, let me ask you a question. Do you know about the Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser?
No.
Look up Gamal Abdel Nasser, read his biography. I can tell you in a nutshell right now.
Go ahead.
Before World War II, Egypt was under British control, and Gamal Abdel Nasser, as a patriot of Egypt, wanted to make Egypt an independent state. And when fighting was going on in Egypt, on one side, the Italians and Nazis, and on the other, the Anglo-American and French forces, Gamal Abdel Nasser served on the side of Germany. He was awarded the Iron Cross for his service. He clearly served the Nazis, but it was in the name of liberating Egypt from Britain. When the Germans lost, and it was the Soviet Union under Khrushchev that provided anti-British support to Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had received the Iron Cross from Rommel for his service to the Nazis, was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union by Khrushchev. Because the Soviet Union supported Egypt in its struggle against the English, the British, for Egypt's liberation. That happens too. Neither Bandera nor Shukovich ever received medals from Adolf Hitler.
Thank you. That's a good argument. I'll take it into account.
Read about the Indians who fought on the side of the Wehrmacht for the liberation of India from Britain. Got it. There, it's a struggle for power. May I read you a quote from the information leaflet of the Presidium of the Ukrainian National Committee on the proclamation of Ukraine's independence and the creation of its government? When the Banderites seized power in Ukraine, the Banderites did not seize power in Ukraine. They proclaimed independence. Just a little quote. Yes, a great historic day is already behind us. Ahead of us lie even more difficult trials and struggles. The Ukrainian nation is fighting shoulder to shoulder with the German people and the German army for a new order in the world. The German army is a friend and ally in the Ukrainian struggle. The Ukrainian armed forces are ready to seal their brotherhood in arms with their German allies in blood. This is expressed in a special greeting, a declaration sent to the leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler, to the German people, and to the victorious German army. That's right, that's enough. No one denies this. I've already explained to you that Ukrainian nationalists wanted to cooperate with Germany, but Germany did not allow it. You are defending the rights of people who are ready to cooperate with Nazi Germany. Gamal Abdel Nasser, hero of the Soviet Union, clearly cooperated with Nazi Germany. He cooperated directly. He received the Iron Cross for his cooperation. And everything you read out, those are just declarations expressing a desire to get support from Germany. And after that, Find Stalin's statement from the 28th or 29th of September 1939, when, after the collapse of Poland by Hitler and Stalin, Stalin sent a telegram to Comrade Hitler, where he wrote that our friendship is sealed in blood. So maybe Stalin was a Nazi too, and cooperated with the Nazis.
Thank you. This is very valuable information because Bogdan and I have different points of view on the SVO, so to speak. And you give me arguments.
Open telegram, Stalin. Type in Stalin, Hitler, friendship sealed in blood. So what? Stalin a Nazi?
There were also, in my opinion, Hitler's parades there.
Yes. Stalin a Nazi?
Stalin, certainly.
There. You see how good it is. Well then Bandera is a Nazi too. Okay, I agree.
I don't deny it. Stalin is a huge tyrant.
Stalin is a tyrant. Stalin is a communist. But Stalin is not a Nazi. But he cooperated with Germany for 2 years, and quite actively at that. They traded with Germany, supplied them with food products.
He supported Germany during...
During what exactly? Until 41. Yes, it was until 41.
the uprising.
Yes,
They supplied Germany with resources during the naval BL blockade by Britain.
absolutely right. The last train headed to the border on June 22nd, 1941. It was stopped at the border by the German side. Because Stalin didn't believe that the Soviet Union had been attacked, he thought it was a provocation and kept ordering supplies and everything else to be sent to the German side.
There was apparently a secret protocol in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Everyone had their own goals. You see, Bandera and Shukovich aimed to achieve an independent Ukraine, yes. In alliance with Nazi Germany, yes. But even Nazi Germany didn't agree to that alliance. This is war. There's no safe crossing in a fire, you know?
Well, that's possible too. That's how it is. Yeah.
And regarding today's cult of Bandera in Ukraine, if the Russian army hadn't invaded Ukrainian territory, then Bandera might have remained a hero only for the western regions of Ukraine. And now the image of Bandera has united all Ukrainians, eastern, western, northern, southern, and central. Because we understand that this was the only force that fought for Ukraine's independence. And right now, we are fighting for Ukraine's independence from their wild country.
Do you have any other arguments, anything else against the UPA?
Not on this topic, no.
All right, any more questions? Young people?
What can we ask? Everything is about the UPA.
Well, you see, you need to read good books.
The revolutions that happen around the world, who sponsors them?
What was that?
Color revolutions. Recently in China, what?
That's called a conspiracy theory. Read up on conspiracy theories.
And why is it called a conspiracy theory?
Well, that's what's called a conspiracy theory. I don't believe in sponsorship.
China officially announced recently that it is against color revolutions. China.
I don't believe that color revolutions are sponsored by someone. Every revolution has its own reason, its own. And some countries, in their own interests, either support and fund these revolutions or oppose them. But revolutions have internal causes. Not revolutions that the West started. The ones that began in North Africa in the early 2000s were anti-dictatorship, in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Egypt, and so on.
Amichun, can I ask another question about Crimea? It's a rather sensitive one, perhaps. I understand your point of view and, well, I won't share my own opinion because I'm being recorded and I'm in Russia. That's that. The question is simply that the majority of Crimea's residents really are for Russia.
How can you determine that? Wait, how can you determine that?
I have a classmate from Crimea whom I used to talk to. People from Chat Roulette, the ones I talk to from Crimea, every single one of them says they're for Russia.
Look, first of all,
I understand where people were taken from. I'm not asking.
First of all, you haven't talked to all the citizens of Crimea. Do you realize that?
Of course.
Secondly, a huge number of pro-Ukrainian citizens left Crimea after the annexation and after the occupation.
Of course.
Secondly, I don't deny that before 2014, I don't deny that maybe the majority of Crimea's population supported Russia. I don't deny it. But that in no way negates Russia's military invasion of Crimea.
No, my question is different.
These are unrelated issues. You understand? What is your question about?
My question is, if Ukraine wants to take Crimea back, how is it going to do that if the population?
Already by military means. If until 2022 all our leaders were saying that the return of Crimea was only possible through diplomatic means, everyone perfectly understands the mood of the people in Crimea. We get it. Everyone understands how complicated this operation would be from a military standpoint. And our leaders said that we would resolve it through diplomatic means, but Russia was in no way willing to do that, because Putin repeatedly stated, Crimea is not up for discussion at any level. Well, and in Donbass, there are no Russian troops. He's been telling that story for 9 years.
Why does Putin need Crimea?
So, when your troops invaded Ukraine on a full scale, all our top officials declared, we will resolve Crimea by military means, and then we'll figure out the rest.
Of course, theoretically, it can be taken back militarily, but the residents...
And then we'll figure out the rest. If the residents served in the armed organizations of the Russian Federation, like the Army, Police, FSB, and so on, there will be court proceedings and everything else, unless they manage to escape in time. As for everyone else, yes, we understand that, for the most part, the general mood might be anti-Ukrainian. So what? We need to do something like the Reconstruction of the South in America. Have you studied it? So, how did the Civil War in America end in the 1860s?
Unfortunately,
The Reconstruction of the South. The South was mostly against the North, but the North won. What happened to all those who supported the South's independence? Some ran off to Mexico, some escaped to Europe. The rest were dealt with, re-educated, told stories, and so on. We won't be carrying out mass executions. We're not Russians.
no, that's clear. Right. Well, thank you for explaining some very important things.
Your colleague Bodon had a question, I think. No, he didn't.
We should have put you together with our university historian. He actually holds the opposite view. Larionov.
Larionov. Which Larionov?
He's terribly and unequivocally pro-Russian, displaying a clear bias.
Orthodox.
Against gays, gay rope, Pindozy, and all the rest, basically.
That's the standard set as xenophobia.
Of course, but it shouldn't be that way. Yeah. Thank you for your arguments about, well, the UPA. This is very important information and...
Guys, come on, read books. Read at least Jegor's Matika from the Volyn Massacre to Operation Vistula. Jegor's Matika is a Polish historian. This is a classic work from the Volyn Massacre to Operation Vistula.
Kuzma.
Yeah.
Well, at least that. Although you have to understand here that he's a Polish historian, and he mostly thinks the Ukrainians were the bad guys and the Poles were the good guys.
Well, that's clear.
But even he gives a bunch of facts where Poles attack Ukrainian villages and destroy the Ukrainian civilian population, because you just can't get away from that.
We were specifically interested in the cooperation with Nazi Germany.
Well, there was no cooperation. It was Stalin's Soviet Union that cooperated with Nazi Germany for 2 years. Now that was real cooperation, with documentation and everything.
I hope I don't get thrown in jail after all this.
They're already filming me, Nisha.
They're already filming me.
It's roulette after all. It's just some bullshit.
The FSB is already watching me.
It's a live broadcast.
Any more questions for me, young people?
No, thank you very much.
At least your field of study is something technical, right?
Technical information systems, technology.
What year are you in?
Second, bachelor's program.
So you just started. Got it. And did you finish all your history classes in the first year? or do you still have some in the second year?
We literally had one semester of history. That's it.
In the orthodox spirit of xenophobia.
No, luckily we had a different history teacher. She was more or less normal. We discussed all sorts of interesting things with her, but we didn't go too deep since it was just one semester.
Well, I see. Yeah, that's what they call a whirlwind tour.
Yeah, basically, just to recall the school curriculum.
I get it. The school curriculum is historical didactics. It's not history.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Thanks for that, too.
History is a science that you have to read and study. You have to read Collingwood, you have to read Toynbee, and so on. Methodology.
Go.
R.G. Collingwood is an outstanding British historian and methodologist. What is history, and how do you study it? Marc Bloch is a French historian and methodologist. The Apology for History is an amazing book. Fernand Braudel is a French historian from the Annals School, just like Marc Bloch. Arnold Joseph Toynbee in A Study of History. There's a 2-volume edition in Russian. And so on. When you start reading this, maybe your understanding of history as a science will change, or maybe it won't.
And what do you think about Panasenkov?
You've already asked that question. I haven't read him.
I've definitely got it now.
He's a good showman. Sometimes his point of view is correct.
Well, it's clear which one is correct. Good luck and patience to you.
Same to you very much.